Welcome to the deep dive, where we cut through the noise and really try to get straight to the knowledge.
If that's the plan.
Today, we're digging into something pretty fundamental: human psychology, understanding ourselves, understanding others.
Absolutely. And we've got, well, a really interesting mix of sources for this deep dive. A classic textbook from the late 70s, Eysenck and Wilson, plus some bits from a more modern book looking at key ideas and figures.
And our mission, as always, is to dive into these sources, pull out the core concepts, maybe some surprising facts, the debates that really shaped the field.
And help you get up to speed quickly on what can be, let's face it, a pretty complex subject.
Okay, let's jump in. The obvious starting point. What is psychology, actually?
Well, the simple answer, the one most people might reach for, is it deals with human behavior.
Right. But lots of fields study behavior: sociology, biology, economics. What makes psychology different?
That's the key question. And the classic textbook offers a really useful angle here. It says psychology looks at how our physiological systems, our brains, our bodies interact,
Right.
but specifically from the point of view of use in actual life. It has to bring in the social side, the real world context.
So it's not just the brain in isolation, it's the brain operating out there dealing with people, situations.
Exactly. A physiologist might stay in the lab, but the psychologist has to integrate these interaction variables. The core paradigm, according to these sources, is that psychology is inevitably about the interplay of biological and social factors.
That interaction again, it keeps coming up. And the sources seem quite concerned about ignoring that complexity.
They are. They use some strong language, actually. They talk about sociotropes. People focus only on the social, and biotropes only focused on the biological.
And they call them
Dangerous.
dangerous. That is strong.
Yep.
Why?
Because, the sources argue, these narrow views tend to impose prejudices rather than learning from the facts. It's a bit of a warning, really, that scientists need, and I quote, their share of humility. Look at the whole picture.
That idea of humility and complexity feels like a good place to anchor ourselves. Now, the field itself has tackled this complexity in, well, very different ways over the years. Let's talk about some early approaches, starting with behaviorism.
Right. Behaviorism. Hugely influential, especially mid-20th century. The defining thing. A really strict focus only on observable behavior.
Meaning they deliberately ignored the internal stuff, thoughts, feelings.
Pretty much, yeah. If you couldn't see it or measure it directly, it wasn't considered scientific territory. Introspection was out.
And their methods reflected that, right? Like the verbal conditioning example.
Exactly. They'd have someone read sentences, and the experimenter might subtly reinforce using a certain pronoun, like they, with a nod or a quiet good.
And the result was just how often the person used they.
Yep, the frequency of the conditioned behavior. Simple as that. And the sources mention these studies sometimes got conflicting results. Maybe introverts conditioned to better, maybe extroverts, maybe no difference.
What about motivation from a behaviorist view?
A lot of that work involved animals, often rats. It led to these drive reduction theories. The basic idea is that behavior is driven by a need to reduce biological drives, hunger, thirst, avoiding pain.
Okay, drive reduction. But then you ask yourself, how well does that really explain, I don't know, writing a sonnet or developing a complex scientific theory? Seems a bit basic for humans.
That's a very common critique and a fair one. The sources even mention people calling it rat psychology and dismissing it as useless for humans.
But the sources push back on that dismissal.
They do. They call that view one-sided itself. The argument is that even these basic principles might be the building blocks for much more complex human actions. You have to start somewhere.
And the fundamental building block here is conditioning itself.
Right, which is basically just a change in how an organism responds. Could be learning a totally new response or just getting more efficient or economical with an existing one.
And the famous type is classical conditioning. Pavlov's dogs and all that.
Exactly. It's all about pairing things up. You start with something that naturally causes a reaction, like food causing salivation. That's your unconditioned stimulus, the UCS,
Right.
leading to the unconditioned response, the UCR.
Mm-hmm.
Then you repeatedly pair a neutral stimulus, something that does nothing initially, like a bell right before the food.
Okay.
After enough pairings, the bell, which was neutral, starts to cause salivation all by itself. It's become a conditioned stimulus, CS, triggering a conditioned response.
CR. And the timing is crucial, isn't it? The bell has to predict the food.
Yes, that temporal relational property is key. A predicts B, and B is usually more intense. The sources also mention that doing it backwards, food, then bell, has different, much weaker effects.
And this isn't just dogs and bells, it applies to humans too, right? Like fears.
Definitely. The sources link this directly to how we might learn fears. It's often a two-step process. First, classical conditioning. Learn to fear a neutral stimulus, the CS, because it got paired with something bad.
Like maybe a certain place gets associated with a panic attack?
Exactly. Then, step two is often instrumental conditioning. You learn what to do about that fear, like avoiding the place. The conditioned anxiety itself acts as a motivator for that avoidance behavior.
Which neatly brings us to the other big type, operant or instrumental conditioning, Skinner's domain.
Right. This is about changing behavior based on its consequences. If an action, an operant, is followed by something positive, a reinforcer, it becomes more likely to happen again.
Like the pigeon pecking a disc to get food.
That's the classic example. Or a child getting praise for tidying up. The key is that the behavior is strengthened because of what follows it. The operant is defined by whatever aspect leads to the reinforcement, like the pigeon raising its head to a certain height.
And Skinner saw this as incredibly broad in its application.
Hugely broad. The sources quote him saying, essentially, that almost everything we do while awake involves acting on the environment, and the consequences shape our behavior. He lists things like walking, playing games, using tools, talking, writing, even driving a car or flying a plane, all built up through operant conditioning.
Wow, that's quite a claim, suggesting our whole repertoire is built this way.
And how often the reinforcement comes matters too.
Yeah.
These schedules of reinforcement, whether it's every time or only sometimes, are powerful tools for developing and controlling behavior.
So behaviorism was dominant, but that focus only on observable behavior eventually prompted a reaction, didn't it?
It did. The cognitive revolution, starting around the late 1950s, psychology swung back towards studying those internal mental processes that behaviorism had sidelined.
Like perception, memory, thinking.
Exactly. Back to the mind, essentially.
Let's start with perception. How we make sense of the world coming in through our senses.
The sources offer a really helpful analogy here. Perception isn't like taking a photograph, which just records everything but still needs interpreting. It's more like creating a map.
A map. How so?
Well, a map transforms reality. It selects key information, leaves other stuff out, uses symbols and conventions. It's an active construction, not just a passive recording. Our perception does something similar.
Okay, that makes sense. And some of this happens automatically.
Yes, the sources mention things like how our visual system automatically detects outlines and edges, especially if things are moving. It says we capitalize on this special kind of redundancy. Basically, we tune out uniformity and pay attention to change.
And some pretty sophisticated perceptual abilities seem to be there very early on.
Right, the constancy phenomena. This is fascinating. Like how we perceive an object's true brightness even if the lighting changes dramatically, or how we know a tabletop is round even if we're looking at it from an angle where the image on our retina is actually an oval.
And the surprising part.
Research suggests these aren't just learned, they seem partially innate. The sources mention evidence of constancy in infants as young as 36 days old.
36 days. That's amazing. So babies' brains are already doing these complex adjustments.
Seems like it. The cognitive approach also brought back ideas from Gestalt psychology.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Kind of. It's about how we automatically group elements in a scene to perceive whole objects or figures. Principles like common fate, things moving together belong together, or closure, filling in gaps to see complete shapes.
And pattern detection fits in here too.
Yes. Studies looked at how people find rules in sequences. One mention found people easily remembered simple patterns, but struggled with complex ones. And interestingly, autistic children in that study had difficulty perceiving the rules, sometimes applying incorrect ones.
All this input requires filtering, which brings us to attention.
The sources point to Donald Broadbent's work, which was really influential. He was inspired by early computing and communication systems, using that information processing analogy.
Like the air traffic controller example, trying to handle multiple signals at once.
Exactly. How do we prioritize? Broadbent's early filter model suggested information hits a temporary store, and then a filter selects information based on basic physical features, like which ear the sound came into.
But later ideas suggested the filter could be more sophisticated.
Yes, perhaps filtering based on meaning later in the process. Broadbent's quote sums it up nicely. Our mind can be conceived as a radio receiving many channels at once. We have to tune in.
Okay, so from perceiving and attending, let's move to memory. The sources mention Ebbinghaus as a pioneer here.
Right. Famously experimenting on himself, memorizing lists of nonsense syllables, he discovered key things like spaced repetition being better than cramming, and the serial position effect. We remember items at the beginning and end of a list best.
And the sources make a really crucial distinction in memory types.
Yes, between primary memory, what we usually call short-term memory, and secondary memory, or long-term memory.
That's the difference.
Primary memory has a very limited capacity, maybe around 7 items, like a phone number you just heard. It seems to rely heavily on acoustic coding, how things sound. Secondary memory, our long-term store, seems potentially unlimited in capacity and relies more on semantic coding, the meaning of information.
And there's evidence backing the split up.
Like the Peterson procedure, showing how quickly information fades from primary memory if you can't rehearse it, often gone within 18 seconds. Also, studies on interference. Similar-sounding words interfere more in short-term recall, while similar-meaning words interfere more in long-term recall. And crucially, studies of amnesic patients.
How so?
Patients like those with Korsakoff syndrome often have severely impaired long-term memory, secondary memory, but their ability to immediately recall the last few items from a list using primary memory can be relatively normal.
Interesting. But memory isn't totally rigid, is it?
No, the sources emphasize its flexibility. How we encode and retain information depends on things like how long we need to remember it, what we intend to do with it, even our expectations. We might use simple sensory coding for brief storage, but more complex organization for longer periods.
So the same material could be remembered differently depending on how we approach it.
Exactly. And just because something fades from short term doesn't mean it's forgotten forever if it was attended to and transferred to long-term memory.
All right, let's tackle thinking and problem solving. The sources admit this is hard to define scientifically.
It's often defined by what it does, like problem-solving behavior, or more internally, as internal representation of events.
Early research often used animals, like Thorndike's cats.
Right, the puzzle box experiments. Cats had to figure out how to escape. Thorndike concluded it was a slow, gradual process of trial and error, governed by reinforcement actions that worked, got strengthened, a precursor to operant conditioning ideas.
But then you have Kohler's work with chimpanzees.
Which seemed very different. His chimps appeared to have sudden flashes of insight, figuring out how to stack boxes or use sticks to reach a banana. It looked like they solved it mentally first, then acted. The classic aha moment.
So trial and error versus insight, which is it?
Well, the sources highlight Harlow's work as a potential bridge. He studied monkeys solving discrimination problems over and over.
What did he find?
Initially, the monkeys used slow trial and error. But as they solved more and more problems, they got faster and faster, eventually solving new problems almost instantly, seemingly with insight.
So Harlow saw them as connected.
Yes, he argued that trial and error and insight are but two different phases of one long, continuous process. Insight wasn't magic. It was the result of experience, of learning how to solve problems, what he called learning set formation, or learning to think.
That's a fascinating perspective insight as a learned skill. What about things that hinder problem solving?
Functional fixedness is a big one, Dunker's idea. Past experience using an object for one purpose makes it hard to see it could be used differently for a new problem. The example given is using a switch in a circuit, then failing to see you could use it as a pendulum weight later.
Your past success blinds you to new possibilities.
Exactly. The Gestalt focus on insight and perceptual reorganization was criticized for downplaying this role of past experience.
And what about different kinds of thinking?
Guilford's distinction between convergent and divergent thinking comes up. Most traditional tests demand one correct answer that's convergent thinking.
Like an IQ test question.
Right. But Guilford proposed divergent thinking abilities, creativity, generating multiple possible solutions. The classic example is, how many uses can you think of for a brick?
And this isn't just for geniuses.
He argued it wasn't,
Yeah.
though the sources note that tests measuring divergent thinking aren't totally separate from IQ. They do tend to correlate with it.
Okay, one last piece under the cognitive umbrella. Emotion. Sources say it's tricky to define.
Very tricky, because the physiological signs, sweating, heart racing, happen in lots of states, like just being excited or interested, not only when we feel emotional.
So what makes it feel like an emotion?
The cognitive perspective suggests it's about our interpretation, our appraisal of the situation, and our bodily state.
This leads to theories like Schachter's.
Yes, Schachter's two-factor theory. He proposed you need two things for an emotional experience. First, general physiological arousal, like your sympathetic nervous system kicking in. And second, a cognitive label you apply to that arousal, based on your current situation.
The epinephrine experiment is the key evidence here, right?
That's the famous one. People were injected with epinephrine, which causes arousal. Some were told what to expect physically, others weren't or were misinformed. Then they were put in a room with someone acting either euphoric or angry.
And the results.
Those who didn't have an explanation for their physical arousal tended to catch the emotion of the person they were with, feeling euphoric with the euphoric person, angry with the angry one. But those who knew the drug caused the arousal were much less influenced.
So same arousal, different emotion depending on the label they applied from the context. Shows the power of interpretation.
Definitely. Okay, let's shift gears dramatically now, away from cognition and behaviorism to psychodynamic theories.
Often called depth psychology, Freud psychoanalysis, but others too.
Yes, the sources mention Jung, Adler, Klein, Lang, from Horney, Sullivan, quite a diverse group, though Freud is central. The unifying idea, really, is that our behavior, especially problematic behavior or psychopathology, stems from hidden forces.
Hidden forces like
Unconscious desires, conflicts, maybe forgotten or repressed experiences. Things kept out of our awareness by defense mechanisms.
So the unconscious is key. What's in there?
According to the theory, it holds memories, thoughts, feelings, reality experiences that are beyond our direct control or awareness. Conflicts simmering down there can manifest as conscious symptoms or emotional pain.
And Freud's therapy, psychoanalysis, aimed to tackle this.
Exactly. The goal was to work through these unconscious conflicts, bring repressed material into the light, and hopefully alleviate the suffering. But it's described as a long, difficult process.
How did they try to access the unconscious?
Techniques like free association. The patient just says whatever pops into their head, trying to bypass conscious censorship. And dream interpretation. Freud famously called dreams the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind.
Because dreams were seen as symbolic expressions of these hidden desires.
That was the idea. Accessing those unprocessed feelings or memories was seen as necessary to deal with the real issues they were causing, releasing the pent-up tension.
Now, psychodynamic theories have faced a lot of criticism over the years, and the sources don't shy away from that.
No, they're quite direct. A major issue raised is the difficulty of scientific appraisal.
How so?
Well, criticisms include things like presenting claims as self-evident truths, Freud has revealed, rather than testable hypotheses, relying heavily on the therapist's clinical intuition, which wasn't always right. The sources mentioned the early, later dropped idea about masturbation causing insanity as an example.
There's also mention of appealing to authority rather than evidence.
Yes, phrases like, as Fenical has told us. And the attitude towards outsiders questioning the theory was sometimes, according to the sources, condescending or hostile.
What about the evidence base itself?
A lot of the early theories were derived from detailed analyses of single cases, like Freud's famous cases of Dora or Little Hans. And sometimes the case material itself was provided by supporters of the theory. Now, the origin isn't fatal if there's later empirical support.
But the sources argue that validation has often been lacking.
They suggest that many core propositions haven't stood up well to scientific testing, or that apparent confirmations often have simpler alternative explanations that weren't considered.
The strong focus on early childhood experiences is also questioned.
Yes, while early experiences obviously matter, the sources critique the specific psychodynamic reasoning, for instance, arguing that just because individual differences seen in infancy persist doesn't automatically prove that infant learning was the crucial cause. They call this a potentially faulty line of reasoning.
And concepts like psychic energy, libido,
Criticized as being scientifically meaningless, unless they can be clearly defined and measured. Too vague to test, essentially.
even the core idea of repression, pushing unwanted thoughts or memories out of awareness, is challenged.
Experimental studies trying to demonstrate repression have often yielded results that, the sources argue, could be explained by simpler mechanisms like memory interference rather than active repression.
And dream interpretation.
Freud's specific theories are questioned. The sources give the example that dream symbolism varies hugely across cultures. Dreaming of your mother might mean honoring your city-state in ancient Greece, not necessarily having hidden sexual desires. They suggest a simpler theory might be that symbolism in dreams is just a more primitive form of thinking that occurs in low arousal states.
So a powerful cultural influence, but questions remain about its scientific standing.
That seems to be the takeaway from these particular sources, yes.
Okay, let's shift from broad theories to how we measure differences between people. Individual differences, starting with psychometrics. Sounds statistical.
It is. Psychometrics is basically the application of statistical methods to psychological measurement. trying to quantify things like abilities or personality traits.
And a fundamental tool here is the correlation coefficient.
Right. It's a number, usually between -1 and +1, that tells you how strongly two things are related. For example, are height and weight related? Is IQ related to exam scores? Correlation tells you the strength and direction of that relationship.
So you can compare things even if they're measured in different units, like inches and IQ points?
Exactly. It gives you a standardized way to see the connection. And when we study people, we usually only study a sample, not everyone. Statistics helps us know if what we found in our sample is likely true for the larger population.
That's statistical significance.
It's about probability. A statistically significant result means it's unlikely to have occurred just by random chance. Psychologists usually use cutoffs like less than 5% probability, p 0.05, or less than 1%, p 0.01.
But the sources add an important caution here.
Yes. Statistical significance doesn't automatically mean psychological significance or practical importance. You can find a statistically real effect that's actually tiny and trivial in the real world.
Okay. What about understanding patterns when you have lots of different measurements?
That's where factor analysis comes in. It's a statistical technique used to identify underlying dimensions or factors that might explain the relationships among a whole set of variables or test scores.
Like with intelligence tests.
Exactly. Spearman was the first to apply it there. He found that performance on different types of cognitive tests tended to correlate, suggesting a common underlying factor which he called G for general intelligence.
But it's not just one factor.
No. Later researchers like Burt added that besides G, there are also more specific group factors like verbal ability, spatial ability, numerical ability. It makes the picture more complex, but the sources argue it doesn't necessarily undermine the idea of a general factor.
And the same method is used for personality traits, too.
Yes. The sources give an example. If you have questionnaire items asking about anxiety and others asking about sociability, factor analysis might show that all the anxiety items cluster together on one factor and all the sociability items on another, and that these two factors are unrelated, supporting the idea they measure independent dimensions like neuroticism and extroversion.
Okay, with that statistical grounding, let's talk specifically about intelligence and IQ. It starts with Binet.
Alfred Binet, yes. He was tasked with developing tests to identify children needing special education in France. He had the clever idea of using age as a benchmark, since children's mental abilities generally increase with age.
Which led to the idea of mental age versus chronological age.
Right. A child's mental age, MA, is the typical age level at which they're performing intellectually. Their chronological age, CA, is just their actual age.
And then Stern came up with the IQ formula.
Yes, the intelligence quotient, or IQ, it's calculated as mental age divided by chronological age, then multiplied by 100 to get rid of decimals. So if an 8-year-old performs like the average 10-year-old, their IQ is 10, 100, and 125. If they perform like a 6-year-old, it's 100, mid-real 75. Average is 100.
And IQ scores tend to be distributed in a bell curve.
Yes, much like height or weight, most people fall in the middle range, about half between 90 and 110. Very few people score at the extremely high or low ends.
The sources present quite a bit of evidence for a genetic basis for intelligence.
They do. Twin studies are prominent here. Identical twins who share 100% of their genes are consistently found to be much more similar in IQ than fraternal twins who share about 50%, even when the identical twins are raised in different homes.
That's powerful evidence suggesting genes play a role. What about the orphanage study?
That study suggested that even when children were raised in very similar controlled environments, the variation in their IQ scores didn't decrease much. The implication being that eliminating environmental differences didn't eliminate the IQ differences, pointing towards genetics.
There's even mention of biological correlations.
Like certain patterns in brainwave responses,
Yeah.
evoked potentials, correlating with IQ scores, and these brainwave patterns themselves showing high similarity in identical twins.
The sources also discuss gender differences in IQ distribution.
Yes, they point to findings suggesting that while average IQ scores might be very similar for men and women, men tend to show greater variability or dispersion.
Meaning?
Meaning men are overrepresented at both the very high end and the very low end of the IQ scale compared to women, who tend to be more clustered around the average.
And the sources speculate this might relate to why men appear more often among both geniuses and those classified as mentally defective, though they add a caution about the mentally defective label being partly social.
Right. They also touch on specific abilities, where average differences sometimes appear like women potentially excelling at rote memory for unrelated facts, while men might do better on certain types of mathematical reasoning. But again, the nature versus nurture question regarding these specific differences is raised. Is it biology or upbringing?
No, IQ testing isn't without its critics. What are some major criticisms mentioned?
A big one is the difficulty of separating heredity and environment. IQ tests inevitably measure skills and knowledge that are acquired through experience and education. How do you truly equalize environments to isolate the genetic component?
It's like that physics analogy. The laws work perfectly in a vacuum, but we don't live in one.
Exactly. So psychologists have tried different approaches. One is using culture fair tests, designed to be less dependent on specific cultural knowledge or language. Things like pattern completion or figure copying.
Contrasting with culture-bound items that rely heavily on specific knowledge.
Right. This ties into the distinction between fluid intelligence, seen as raw reasoning ability, closer to genetic potential, and crystallized intelligence, the application of that ability to accumulated knowledge and skills.
Huh?
Culture fair tests aim to tap fluid intelligence, while traditional tests often measure crystallized intelligence.
And the test format itself gets criticized. The single right answer focus.
Yes, the emphasis on convergent thinking, which contrasts with divergent thinking creativity, finding multiple solutions. Though, as mentioned before, the sources note that tests of divergent thinking do tend to correlate with traditional IQ scores.
Okay, let's shift from intelligence to the broader concept of personality.
Personality in this context is mainly about enduring characteristics, or traits, consistent patterns of behavior, thought, and feeling, rather than just temporary states or moods.
So, calling someone sociable is describing a trait they tend to enjoy parties, talk a lot.
Exactly. It's descriptive, not necessarily an explanation in itself.
How do psychologists try to measure these traits?
Several ways are mentioned. Self-report questionnaires are very common, asking people directly about their typical behavior or feelings. Do you often worry?
But people might not answer honestly.
That's a drawback. So another method is ratings by others, asking friends, family, teachers to rate the person's typical behavior. This avoids self-report bias, but introduces other biases, like the rater's own impressions or limited knowledge of the person.
The sources quote Eysenck saying a rating is always an interaction between rater and ratee.
A good point. A third approach involves physiological measures, looking at things like heart rate, skin conductance, brain activity, trying to get at underlying biological tendencies related to personality without relying solely on what people say about themselves.
Eysenck's model of personality dimensions is central in these sources.
Yes, based on factor analysis of questionnaire data, he proposed a few major independent dimensions. The two best known are neuroticism stability and emotional stability versus instability.
And extroversion, introversion.
Yeah.
E, outgoing versus reserved.
Right. He later added a third major dimension, psychoticism, P, sometimes described as tough-mindedness versus tender-mindedness. High P is associated with traits like coldness, aggression, impulsivity, and antisocial tendencies.
Important note, this isn't the same as being clinically psychotic.
Correct. It's seen as a dimension of normal personality, but people with diagnoses like schizophrenia or psychopathy do tend to score high on the P scale. Eysenck argued these three dimensions, P, N, and E, could summarize a vast amount of personality variation and even provide a framework for psychiatric diagnosis.
Like defining a color by its position on dimensions of hue, saturation, and brightness.
Precisely. And just like intelligence, these personality dimensions appear to have a significant genetic basis.
Twin studies again?
Yes. Studies comparing identical twins, MZs reared apart, and together with fraternal twins, Ds reared together, find that MZs are considerably more alike on personality questionnaires than DZs, even when the MZs grew up in different families.
Suggesting genes contribute substantially, though environment obviously plays a role too.
Absolutely. The sources conclude both are clearly important. There's also research into the biological basis, particularly for extroversion-introversion.
The arousal theory.
Right. The idea is that introverts have a higher baseline level of cortical arousal, so they avoid strong stimulation, while extroverts have lower baseline arousal and actively seek out stimulation to reach an optimal level.
Is there evidence for that?
Some studies support it. For example, research found that stimulant drugs tend to shift behavior towards introversion, increasing arousal, while depressant drugs shift behavior towards extroversion, lowering arousal, mirroring the baseline differences between the groups on things like conditioning or vigilance tasks.
And then there's that surprising link mentioned between personality and sexual attitudes and behavior.
Yes, the sources detail research from that era suggesting links. For instance, extroverts were reported as being more promiscuous, less inhibited, starting sexual activity earlier, having more partners, and being more satisfied. High neuroticism was linked to nervousness, guilt, inhibition, and dissatisfaction despite potentially high drive. High psychoticism was linked to even higher drive, perhaps acted out more readily in promiscuous or unconventional ways, but still accompanied by general unhappiness.
Definitely falls into the surprising, maybe even controversial findings category from these older sources.
It's presented as empirical findings from that time, yes.
Okay, shifting from the individual to interactions between individuals. Social psychology.
Yeah.
The sources credit Gestalt psychology, particularly Kurt Lewin, as a major influence here.
Right, focusing on the whole situation, the person within their social environment. A key area is interpersonal interaction.
Like self-disclosure, revealing things about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Research mentioned suggests that people who disclose more intimately tend to be liked more, and that self-disclosure is often reciprocated. You tell me something personal, I'm more likely to tell you something personal. Higher levels seem linked to greater liking.
Implications for therapy, too.
Suggested that a therapist being genuine and self-disclosing appropriately might encourage the client to open up more.
What about how we communicate, verbal versus nonverbal?
The common idea discussed is that words primarily convey information, while nonverbal cues, tone, posture, facial expression, primarily convey emotions and the nature of the relationship. Are we equals? Is one dominant? Is there warmth or hostility?
And the sources say nonverbal cues are often more powerful.
Studies where messages were ambiguous, for example, saying something nice in a sarcastic tone, suggested the nonverbal cues were more influential in revealing the true state of the relationship.
This ties into implicit personality theory, or IPT, our assumptions about people.
Exactly. It's the personal map we have in our heads about which traits go together. If we perceive someone as warm, we might automatically assume they're also generous or good-natured, even without specific evidence. This IPT shapes how we see and react to others.
And these assumptions can be triggered by superficial things.
Yes, the sources give examples like assuming someone smartly dressed donating blood did it freely, while someone roughly dressed was coerced. Or the fascinating study by Argyle and McHenry.
The one about glasses.
Right. People initially rated individuals wearing glasses as more intelligent. But, and this is the crucial part, this bias completely disappeared after just 5 minutes of actual conversation with the person.
Wow. So a little bit of real interaction can override those stereotypes based on appearance?
It seems so,
Yeah.
in that case. The sources also touch on predicting behavior in interactions. General patterns are noted, like aggression often breeding aggression, and friendliness breeding friendliness.
But it's not always simple reciprocity.
No, Leary's model suggested complexities like dominant behavior might elicit submissive behavior, and vice versa. The research showed it's not always straightforward. Sometimes competitive behavior just elicits more competition.
Moving to groups.
Yeah.
Cooperation versus competition.
A classic theme, often studied using games or bargaining scenarios. One famous paradigm is the prisoner's dilemma.
Ah, yes. Where two individuals, acting rationally in their own self-interest, end up with a worse outcome than if they'd trusted each other and cooperated.
Exactly. It highlights the tension between individual gain and collective good. Studies using this found various factors influence whether people compete or cooperate, things like how many times they play, tend to get more competitive, age, culture, whether they know the other person. Strangers are more competitive.
What about influence within groups? Conformity.
The Ash experiment is the textbook example here. People were asked to judge line lengths, a really simple perceptual task.
But the catch was,
Everyone else in the group, who were secretly Confederates, started giving the same, obviously wrong answer. And the finding was that a significant number of genuine participants, about a third in one key study, went along with the wrong majority at least some of the time, even though they could clearly see the correct answer.
just due to the pressure of the group.
Seems so. And the conformity increased with a larger majority. But crucially, having just one other person give the correct answer dramatically reduced conformity. Having an ally makes a big difference.
Even more dramatic are the studies on obedience to authority, Milgram's experiments.
Yes, truly landmark and disturbing studies. Participants were told they were part of a learning experiment and had to administer electric shocks to another person, a Confederate, the learner, whenever they made a mistake,
And the shocks increased in intensity.
right up to levels marked danger, severe shock. The experimenter, the authority figure in a lab coat, instructed the participant to continue even when the learner protested, screamed, or eventually fell silent.
And many people obeyed.
A disturbingly high percentage, around two-thirds in the original studies, went all the way to the maximum shock level, simply because the authority figure told them to continue. It powerfully demonstrated how susceptible people can be to obeying authority, even when it conflicts with their own conscience.
The sources suggest this stems from early socialization, obeying parents, teachers.
That's the implication. But like conformity, obedience wasn't absolute. If the participant saw another teacher, also a Confederate, refuse to continue, their own obedience dropped dramatically. Dissent is powerful.
The sources connect these small group dynamics to larger social issues.
Yes, suggesting principles from group interaction can help understand phenomena like fads, crowd behavior, even how social problems get defined. Bloomer's idea is mentioned that something becoming a social problem is a collective process of definition, not just an objective fact.
And role theory is brought up too.
The idea that our behavior is shaped by the social roles we occupy, parent, student, employee, etc., and the expectations that come with those roles.
Okay, that's a good overview of social interaction. Let's turn to how psychology is applied, specifically in understanding and treating psychological problems, starting with psychiatric diagnosis and assessment.
A fundamental distinction in psychiatry mentioned is between organic disorders, with a known physical cause, like brain damage, and functional disorders, where the cause is less clear. Within functional, you have the traditional categories of neurosis and psychosis, along with personality disorders often seen as distinct.
And the difficulty of defining emotional states comes up again.
Yes, the overlap with general arousal and the importance of cognitive appraisal and labeling an experience as a specific emotion, referencing Schachter's work again.
But the sources raise serious questions about the diagnostic system itself.
They do. Specifically about its reliability. Do different clinicians agree on a diagnosis for the same patient? The sources cite studies showing quite low agreement for many categories, sometimes only 30–40%.
And if reliability is low, validity is questionable too. Meaning, does the diagnosis actually tell you anything useful about the person's prognosis or treatment needs?
Exactly. Low reliability undermines validity. As an alternative, the sources advocate for a dimensional approach, like Eysenk's PNE model. Instead of putting people in boxes, describe their position on relevant continua.
This is seen as a better fit for mental health issues.
The argument is yes, because many conditions seem like extreme versions of normal traits or learned patterns, rather than distinct diseases like in physical medicine.
Sure.
Genetic evidence also often points to multiple genes conferring risk, polygenic, which aligns better with dimensions than categories.
What about the main assessment tool, the clinical interview?
Widely used, obviously, but the sources are pretty critical of its demonstrated validity, especially for prediction. Studies comparing interview-based predictions, for example, for military success, with simple statistical predictions based on background data, often found the statistical approach was just as good, if not better.
And interviewers might make up their minds quite early.
Research suggests that yes, and longer interviews don't necessarily lead to more accurate judgments. The suggestion is interviews are useful, but perhaps more for gathering history or understanding someone's perspective, rather than being the sole basis for diagnosis or prediction.
Okay, let's move into applied therapy itself. Behavior therapy first.
This flows directly from the learning principles we discussed earlier, classical and operant conditioning. It's about applying those principles systematically to change specific problem behaviors.
Like using reinforcement in institutions or schools.
Yes, reinforcing desired behaviors, like a child speaking calmly, and ignoring or not reinforcing undesired ones, like crying for attention. The sources show an example where this successfully reduced crying, and the effect reversed when the old reinforcement patterns returned.
But it's not just about coercion.
No, a crucial distinction is made. The goal is to help the patient develop and adopt more adaptive behaviors, not just force compliance while the therapist is watching. Real change needs to be internalized.
Socialization itself is framed as a type of conditioning.
Yes, learning to inhibit socially unacceptable behavior. The theory mentioned involves fear or anxiety getting conditioned to cues associated with the prohibited act, which then stops you from doing it. This connects back to potential personality differences in how easily people condition.
How effective is behavior therapy overall, according to these sources?
The picture is mixed, as often is the case in therapy research. Some retrospective studies suggested it was more effective than psychotherapy for certain neuroses. Studies on phobias showed techniques like systematic desensitization could be effective, sometimes more so than traditional psychotherapy in direct comparisons, achieving results faster.
Systematic desensitization, that's the gradual exposure while relaxed.
Exactly. Other techniques mentioned include flooding or implosion, more intense exposure, aversion therapy, pairing unwanted behaviors like fetishes with unpleasant stimuli like shocks, and modeling, learning by observing others overcome their fears.
But there are still debates and challenges.
Oh yes, the exact mechanisms of why these techniques work are still debated. Patient motivation is important, and a major practical challenge is ensuring that improvements made in the therapy room actually transfer and generalize to the person's real life.
What about psychodynamic therapy and application?
Mentioned again with its aim of resolving unconscious conflicts, but the sources reiterate the earlier points about challenges in scientific validation based on the evidence they reviewed.
Other therapies get a mention too. Client-centered therapy.
Yes, Carl Rogers' approach. The focus is on the therapist providing core conditions: empathy, unconditional positive regard, acceptance, and genuineness. The goal isn't to direct the client, but to create a supportive space where they can grow in self-awareness, self-trust, and independence. Rogers saw the good life as a process, not a destination.
And rational emotive therapy, RET.
Albert Ellis's approach. This one is more directive. It focuses on identifying and actively challenging irrational beliefs that are seen as the root cause of emotional distress, teaching people to distinguish rational from irrational thinking.
Interestingly, one study mentioned suggested different therapies might suit different personalities.
Yes, the DiLoretto study suggested client-centered therapy might be better for extroverts, RET better for introverts, while systematic desensitization worked well for both groups in that particular study. Highlights the potential need for tailoring therapy.
Finally, there's social treatment and rehabilitation.
This shifts the focus to the social environment. Interventions might aim to change specific behaviors relevant to social functioning, like employability, or focus on overall adjustment. Examples include rehabilitation workshops or creating supportive community living arrangements like the Fairweather Lodges.
Which showed positive results.
Yes, lower rehospitalization rates and higher employment compared to standard aftercare in that study. Training family members to be supportive is also highlighted.
And that surprising finding about hospital behavior versus discharge behavior?
Right, that sometimes being difficult in the hospital correlated with better social functioning after discharge. A counterintuitive finding suggesting inpatient behavior isn't always a straightforward predictor of real-world adjustment.
To wrap up, the sources cover some anti-psychiatry and alternative views, critiques of the mainstream.
Yes, figures who challenge traditional psychiatric thinking. Artie Lang, for instance, with his existential perspective on schizophrenia, sometimes viewing it not just as illness, but as a potentially meaningful, albeit difficult, journey or breakthrough, though the sources also note controversies around his ideas.
David Rosenhan's study.
Famous for sending pseudo-patients into psychiatric hospitals to see if staff could tell they were sane. They couldn't. Raised big questions about diagnostic labels in hospital environments.
Thomas Saz and the myth of mental illness.
A very controversial figure arguing that most conditions labeled mental illness are actually problems in living, not medical diseases in the traditional sense.
Others offered different perspectives on development and well-being.
Yes, Bettelheim questioning the absolute necessity of the biological mother-child bond, suggesting professional carers could be effective. Dolto emphasizing education as letting children find their own path. Cyrulnik on resilience.
Resilience, the ability to bounce back. What was key there?
Cyrulnik's point, highlighted in the source, is that resilience isn't an innate trait you either have or don't. It's built through interaction, through supportive relationships. His quote is powerful. Alone, a child has no resilience.
Dorothy Rowe's idea about depression.
Linking it to belief in a just world. If you believe the world is fundamentally fair, then when bad things happen to you, you might conclude you must deserve them, leading to self-blame. Overcoming that self-blame is key to recovery, in her view.
And finally, Paul Watzlawick.
Known for questioning the focus on insight in traditional therapy, sometimes arguing insight may cause blindness if it keeps people stuck analyzing the past instead of changing the present. He favored brief therapy targeting specific problems and emphasized the relationship itself as crucial.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive through a lot of foundational concepts and debates in psychology, as seen through these particular sources.
It really covers a huge amount of ground, doesn't it?
Yeah.
From defining the field itself as this biosocial interaction through behaviorism, the cognitive revolution, psychodynamics.
To how we measure intelligence and personality, how social influence works, the complexities of diagnosis, different therapy approaches, and even challenges to the whole system.
And hopefully, highlighting some of those specific, maybe surprising findings along the way, like the early onset of constancy in babies, Harlow's monkeys literally learning to think, Schachter's emotion labeling study, the IQ distribution differences, Milgram's obedience results, how quickly interaction can trump bias, the idea of resilience being built not inherent, the just world linked to depression, the reliability issues in diagnosis.
Hmm.
Hopefully that gives you some useful shortcuts into this fascinating field.
It definitely underscores the complexity. Seeing how all these factors, biology, environment, our own thoughts and interpretations interact, and how different schools of thought have tried to make sense of it all.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Considering this sheer complexity and the different lenses psychologists use, what does that tell you about the challenges, but also maybe the possibilities of truly understanding ourselves and each other?
That's definitely something to ponder.